if, for example, we're in a Chapter 7 and we're talking about a personal Chapter 7, then no, the debtor isn't going to even have the authority to start selling assets, because the person who has the authority over the bankruptcy estate is the Chapter 7 trustee. And it's that Chapter 7 trustee who has the authority to liquidate assets for the benefit of creditors. But not only can the debtor not be forced to sell assets in a Chapter 7, in fact, the debtor doesn't have the authority to do that. It's actually the same in a business Chapter 7. Now, the business Chapter 7s tend not to be as common. They arise if, for example, the business is shutting down, there are assets, there are debts, and the owners don't want to do the legwork liquidating the assets to pay creditors, so they file that Chapter 7 and just turn everything over to the Chapter 7 trustee to do the liquidation. Once again, it's the Chapter 7 trustee that does the liquidation. Of course, there is a wrinkle there, and that is that in a Chapter 7, a business can't get a discharge. Discharges under Chapter 7 are only for individual debtors, not for businesses. So there has to be a really good reason for a business to file a Chapter 7. And sometimes I have people who call up and say, I want to shut my business down and file a Chapter 7. Okay. What sort of assets do you have? Well, there aren't any assets. The business has no assets. Well, then there's no point in filing that business Chapter 7, because there's nothing for the Chapter 7 trustee to do. The business can't get a discharge, so exactly what do you think you're accomplishing? And that's usually because people have a somewhat unrealistic picture of what bankruptcy is all about. In a Chapter 13, generally speaking, there is no liquidation of assets. And that's because the debtor keeps everything and simply uses future income to pay all or portion of the debts through a court-administered Chapter 13 plan. The plan, of course, has to satisfy some requirements, and as long as the debtor can satisfy those requirements in the plan, the judge will confirm the plan, and then the debtor makes those payments according to the terms of the plan. Now, if the debtor has insufficient income to be able to support that Chapter 13 plan, the debtor may sell assets as sort of a partial liquidating plan to use the proceeds to pay creditors. But I will say the debtor doesn't have the authority to do that willy-nilly. In each case, if the debtor is going to start selling assets, which means liquidating stuff in the bankruptcy estate, then the debtor has to get the judge's permission, and we will file a motion for authority to sell an asset, and the proceeds are all going to have to go to paying off creditors. So you might wonder why somebody would do that. Well, occasionally I've had a situation where somebody in Chapter 13 has a house that's appreciated greatly in value. They just want to be done with the plan. They can sell the property, use the proceeds to pay off the remainder of the plan, and still have money left over to relocate somebody someplace else. So that's where I have seen this sort of thing come up. But again, you used the word forced to sell assets, and that really doesn't apply there. Finally, in a Chapter 11, the term force still is a little bit tricky here. Even if there has been an adversary proceeding, what is the adversary proceeding all about? Well, it depends on what kind of adversary we're talking about. If there was an adversary to determine that the debtor engaged in some sort of theft and has assets that don't belong to the debtor, then the adversary proceeding might consist of a request to order turnover of those assets. And if that's the case, then it's not really so much a forced sale as a disgorgement of ill-gotten gains. And that even sometimes happens in a Chapter 7, where the Chapter 7 trustee will file an action to have turnover of something that should have been in the bankruptcy estate that the debtor failed perhaps to disclose and the trustee found out about. So in that scenario, when you have some sort of a turnover action, the debtor really better list everything honestly in the bankruptcy petition, because if debtor hides assets, not only is that grounds for having a discharge denied, but it is grounds for, and I say this with a little bit of a silver lining, getting free room and board with the federal government, because there the debtor will end up in a federal penitentiary as opposed to a state penitentiary. To be honest, I've never actually been in a penitentiary because I've never taken a criminal case, but I have had bankruptcy clients who, prior to becoming my bankruptcy clients, had in some cases spent years in penitentiaries, and they have assured me that the food is better in the federal penitentiaries. But rather than finding that out experientially, I tell my clients, let's just take their word for it, tell the truth, disclose all your assets, make a clean breast of it, and then you won't have that problem. Because in essence, when you're going into bankruptcy, part of what's happening is you're entering into an agreement with the United States. You're completely honest and you qualify for the relief you're looking for, and the federal government will come in and tell your creditors, you've got to accept what's going on here. But if you haven't met your part of the bargain and listed all of your assets, all of your debts, all of your income, all of your expenses, and whatever else is at work there, since you haven't met your end of the bargain, the United States is going to come back after you and say, okay, fella, using the term fella generically here, because you did that, we're not going to let you get a discharge, number one. And if your action is particularly egregious, we're going to throw you in prison because of the crime of perjury. So honesty is the best policy in life generally, and it's especially the best policy in bankruptcy. And there was a witticism of Mark Twain's. He said, always tell the truth. That way you don't have to try to keep track of the lies. Because if you lie, then one lie upon another, you end up with a big problem with internal inconsistency in what you've said. Anyway, tell the truth.